This is part 2 of my 1973 trip to Europe. In the part 1 video, I spent 2 days in London, England, seeing many of the sites with my tour group. Then we flew to Amsterdam in the Netherlands, where we boarded the bus which would take us around Europe. After seeing Amsterdam, we spent the night in Rotterdam, Holland. Next, we traveled to 5 German cities: Cologne, Bapard, Frankfurt, Rothenburg, and Munich. After that, we visited 4 cities in Austria: Salzburg, Melk, Vienna, and Graz. From Graz, we saw 2 Italian cities, Venice and Florence. And now part 2 of my 1973 trip to Europe. The morning of July 6th was day 14 of the trip. This morning we woke up a little early because we would be driving the longest distance of the tour to that point, from Florence to our next destination, Rome. We arrived in Rome in the late afternoon and spent the rest of that day and the next 2 full days in Rome. On our first full day in Rome, we were driven to the Colosseum and taken on a tour of that site. Next, we walked over to the Roman Forum and were given a tour of that section of Rome. The large building on the right in this picture is a reconstruction of the Roman Senate. Not far from the Colosseum and Roman Forum is a little church in which are displayed the chains they used on St. Peter before his execution. Next, our tour guide took us to see the Trevi Fountain, famed for the legend of the 3 coins in the fountain. That legend says that if you throw a coin into the fountain, you will be assured to return to Rome someday. After lunch, we were taken to see the Victor Emmanuel Monument, named after the king that united Italy in the 19th century. The monument is right across the street from this building. During World War II, Mussolini gave his speeches from the balcony above the red sign. Early the next morning, we were taken on a tour of the Vatican. I shot this picture of Rome from the 2nd floor of the Vatican. We were also able to get a glimpse of the Vatican gardens during the tour. Next door to the Vatican was St. Peter's Basilica. One of the statues in the basilica is called the Pietà, which was made by Michelangelo. At the time I saw it, the Pietà had nothing to protect it from vandals. A few years after my visit, a madman ran up and started hitting the statue with a hammer. They repaired the statue and then erected a glass partition to protect it. As it turns out, this was Sunday, and every Sunday around noon, the Pope comes out on this balcony and addresses the people gathered in St. Peter's Square. If you look very closely, you can just make out the Pope. On the following day, we started towards the city of Sorrento. On the way, we stopped at the ancient Roman city of Pompeii, which was destroyed by a volcano in the year AD 79. The city remained under a blanket of ash for centuries until uncovered in the 1800s. We were given a tour of Pompeii by a local guide. This is a mold of one of Pompeii's residents, showing the position he was in when he died. After we finished at Pompeii, we were driven to our hotel in Sorrento. We would spend the rest of that day and all of the next day in and around Sorrento. At about 10 o'clock that night, my friends from the tour knocked on my door and asked if I wanted to walk from our hotel down to the Mediterranean and go swimming. I agreed, and we walked down to this pier. At that time of night, there were no lights and no other people around. The water was pitch black. As it turns out, and for whatever reason, I have always been scared to death of swimming in pitch black water. It took everything I had to smile and slip into the water with my friends. After what seemed like an eternity, we decided to get out and go back to the hotel. I had a hard time sleeping that night. The next morning we were driven to the Sorrento marina, where we boarded a boat that took us out to the island of Capri, about 10 miles off the coast. The first thing we did after we arrived at the Capri marina was transfer to a smaller boat which took us to the entrance of a water-level cave called the Blue Grotto. At that point we were broken into small groups, and each group then transferred to a small rowboat. Each rowboat would then get in line and one at a time would enter the opening of the Blue Grotto. Each person in a group had to duck down as the boat entered the cave. Once inside, visitors were greeted by a sight that is truly breathtaking. I have never been so impressed about a tourist attraction in my life. After everyone had come out from the Blue Grotto, we got back into the larger boat and returned to the Capri marina. For the rest of the day, we were free to do as we pleased on Capri. My friends and I decided to go swimming in the ocean near the marina before we did anything else. After swimming for a while, we started back to the beach. Just then we saw an elderly woman going through my pants by where we had left our things on the sand. We went over and asked what she was doing. The woman replied in very broken English and gestures that she had put her husband's wallet into my pants by mistake and was trying to retrieve it. I laughed and said, "Right." Then she proceeded to pull her husband's wallet out of my pants pocket. We all laughed and she left. I never knew for sure if that was the whole truth, but looking back on it now, I think it was. After that incident, we had lunch, then we walked around the town of Capri. That afternoon, all of us got on the boat which would take us back to Sorrento. We slept really well that night. Next morning was another early departure time. Our next stop, Pisa, home of the Leaning Tower. After arriving, we walked to the tower and I was surprised at how much it leaned. We had free access to walk up to the top of the tower. The spiral stairs in the tower were built along the inside edge of the tower walls, and because of the amount of lean, half of each circuit of the stairs was hard to climb, and the second half of each circuit was easy. The view from on top of the tower was spectacular. The tower is really a bell tower, and here I am with one of the bells. After seeing the tower, we were taken to our hotel in Pisa and spent the night there. The days seemed to be flying by quickly now. The next day our destination was the Principality of Monaco. This tiny country was ruled at that time by Prince Rainier and Princess Grace, formerly Grace Kelly. Monaco is a very upscale country with more than its share of millionaires and the accompanying yachts and chauffeur-driven cars. It is also the home of the famous Monaco Casino. The casino was the scene of a funny event that involved me and a family that was part of my tour group. The family included a father, a mother, son, and 13-year-old daughter. Now, the casino never allows anyone under the age of 21 into the casino, but the daughter really wanted to say she had seen the casino. So with her parents' permission, I hooked her arm around mine and the five of us walked to the door. The guard at the door said in French, "Quel âge a-t-elle?" which means, "How old is she?" I kept walking with the daughter and said, 21, which means 21. This was the first time I actually got to use my high school French. The guard said again, "Quel âge a-t-elle?" but now with more force. I repeated, 21, and continued walking with the daughter. The guard obviously gave up because he said nothing more and the five of us were in. After we saw the casino, we all reboarded the bus and started off. We passed by the royal palace, so this is the only picture of the palace that I got. We then continued to our next destination, Nice, France, where we spent the rest of the day and all the following day. The next day we wanted to go swimming in the ocean at Nice, but were shocked to find out that the city had purposely covered the beach with egg-sized rocks, which made it nearly impossible to lay on the beach. We learned that they did this to force people to rent cushions to enable them to lay on the beach. We knew that we were stuck, so we grudgingly rented the cushions. That would have been bad enough, but when we tried swimming in the water there, we saw human waste floating in the water, which very quickly forced us out of the water. All in all, not the best experience. The next day was July 14th, which was the 22nd day of our trip. This morning we were driven northward to Grenoble, France. This was just a lunch stop, and I decided not to take any pictures because I was starting to run low on film. This picture I got off the internet. After lunch, we headed for Geneva, Switzerland. About an hour before reaching Geneva, we stopped to see the Charles Albert Bridge, which spans the Ussys River in the Rhône-Alpes region of France. This bridge was the highest elevation bridge in the world from its opening in July of 1839 until 1912. We continued on to Geneva, where we spent the night. Geneva's signature logo is visible in this picture, a fountain at the entrance to Lake Geneva. The fountain shoots water up to a height of 420 feet. The next morning we had to wake up early because our travels that day would involve driving through mountains, which always requires more time. We stopped for lunch in Berne, the capital of Switzerland. Again, to save film, I shot no pictures in Berne, but I really wanted to. Our final destination of the day turned out to be my second favorite city of the entire trip after Paris, Lucerne, Switzerland. We would spend the rest of that day and the next full day in Lucerne. Lucerne was a picture-perfect little city. The buildings were all right out of a movie. The people were the most friendly of any I met in Europe, and everything in the city was so clean. This description fit not only Lucerne, but the entire country of Switzerland. If Lucerne has a signature logo, it would have to be the Chapel Bridge, the oldest wooden-covered bridge in Europe. The bridge is named after the nearby St. Peter's Chapel. What makes the bridge so special is the artwork on the supporting structure. This is a much clearer picture of it I got off the internet. To see all the art, you must walk the entire bridge one way, then turn around and walk back the other way. The next morning, we had free time to wander around the town and do some shopping. After lunch, we were taken on a short boat ride. The boat took us across the lake and dropped us off in a little town called Visnau, where we boarded a cogwheel train that took us up to the top of Mount Rigi. The first thing we saw after we got off the train was right out of a Ricola commercial. The view from the top of Mount Rigi was spectacular. It seemed like we could see all of Switzerland. It was incredibly warm that day, even on the summit. Altogether, another fantastic experience. After a couple of hours on the summit, we retraced our journey and returned to Lucerne. That night we were treated to a dinner that began with cheese fondue, which I really enjoyed. The next morning we were driven back into France. Our first and only stop of the day was Dijon. I took no pictures, so, again, this is from the internet. The next morning for me was the most exciting of the trip. That day we were going to Paris, the most anticipated destination of the trip for me. On the way to Paris, we stopped first at Fontainebleau Palace, which is about 35 miles south of Paris. Fontainebleau started out as a hunting lodge for the kings of France. Later, it was expanded to its current palace form. Oh, by the way, the girl in this picture is the one I took into the Monaco casino. We did not go inside the palace, we only walked around the grounds. Later, we reboarded the bus and headed for Paris. Our hotel was on the outskirts of Paris, so we stopped there first. We would spend the rest of that day and the next 2 full days in Paris. After we had checked into our rooms, we were driven to the site that most represented Europe to me, the Eiffel Tower. Here is a picture of one of the legs of the tower, and this is a picture looking up at the tower. These are the tracks of the elevator which took us up to the 2nd level of the tower. I shot this from the elevator as it was going up. This is a view of the top of the tower from the 2nd level. The following are views of Paris from the 2nd level of the tower. In this picture you can see the Arc de Triomphe. This is the River Seine, which runs through the center of Paris. In the distance on the hill is the church of Sacré-Cœur. In the foreground is a museum called Les Invalides. Napoleon's tomb is under the dome of that building. In the distance you can just make out Notre Dame Cathedral. Here is the Trocadero Gardens, which is across the river from the Eiffel Tower. Take note of this picture and compare it to the next picture, which I took after we had gone up to the top of the Eiffel Tower. The top of the Eiffel Tower is about 380 feet higher than the 2nd level of the tower. This is looking straight down from the top of the tower. And this is the electronic equipment that was on the very top of the tower in 1973. I am sure they have something totally different there now. After visiting the tower, we were driven back to our hotel where we had dinner. Later, we were taken on a nighttime driving tour of Paris with several stops. The first stop was in front of the Louvre Museum. This was before they built the glass pyramid in front of the museum. Before we left, I turned around and got this shot looking at the Arc de Carrousel. I had set my camera on the hood of a parked car and took a guess at how long to leave the shutter open. I guessed pretty well. We next went to the Place de la Concorde at more or less the center of Paris. This is one of the fountains there. Finally, we were taken up to the top of Montmartre, where I had my first taste of crepes. I had them make mine with fruit and jelly. When we got back to our hotel, all of us were bushed. I had the best night's sleep of the entire trip that night. On the morning of day 27, we were dropped off at the Place de la Concorde, then escorted down the Champs-Élysées to the Arc de Triomphe. We rode the elevator up to the roof of the Arc and took in the views of Paris. I don't know if you can tell or not, but this day was really cold despite the fact that it was the middle of July. I had not brought anything heavier than a windbreaker, so I was freezing. Following are views of Paris we had from the Arc. Here again is Montmartre. This is the Champs-Élysées, the main shopping street of Paris. After we returned to street level, I took this view of the Champs-Élysées. After leaving the Arc, we found a nearby restaurant for lunch. All during lunch I had an urge to act silly, so while everyone else was still finishing eating, I decided to try my hand at directing traffic. The lady next to me is doing her impression of the lady in the opening of the Mary Tyler Moore Show. Our next stop was at the Louvre Museum, where we took a whirlwind tour of the museum. We next walked to Notre Dame Cathedral. After that, we walked to the Royal Chapel of Sainte-Chapelle with its 1,113 stained glass windows. Needless to say, when we returned to our hotel later that day, we were exhausted. On our last day in Paris, we were taken to the Palace of Versailles, which is about 15 miles outside of Paris. The palace grounds were the most impressive of all the palaces we saw on this trip. The interior of the palace was the most ornate of all we saw in Europe. After we returned from Versailles, we had the afternoon free to do as we pleased. The following day, we left Paris and drove north to Brussels, Belgium. We stopped at the site of the 1958 Brussels World's Fair. This was how the fair looked in 1958, and this is how it looked in 1973. The structure behind me is called the Atomium. It was the centerpiece of the fair. The most controversial exhibit at the fair in 1958 was a copy of the Soviet Sputnik satellite that had just been launched into orbit that year. The buildings that comprised the rest of the World's Fair in 1958 were long since deserted by 1973. Today, the buildings have been refurbished and are used for conferences. We spent the last night of our trip in Brussels. Day 30, the last day of my trip. We left Brussels and headed north, bound for Amsterdam, from which we would catch our plane to LA. We would make only one more stop before Amsterdam, a place called Madurodam. Madurodam is a park and tourist attraction about 35 miles south of Amsterdam. It is home to scale model replicas of famous Dutch landmarks, historical cities, and large developments. The park was opened in 1952. The park has many residents, that is, scaled model people who change with the weather. They wear jackets and warm clothes in the winter and t-shirts in the summer. The residents of Madurodam are also multicultural. The miniature airport is a scale model of the one in Amsterdam, and the shipping port is a scale model of the one in Rotterdam. We had lunch at Madurodam, and then we left for the last leg of our trip to Amsterdam. They dropped us off at the Amsterdam airport, where we boarded the same plane that had brought us to London. While I was sad for the trip to end, I was very happy to be going home and seeing my parents and friends. Unlike the couple with whom I had spent most of my time on the trip, I was still one of the few people on the plane who could not sleep. Not only that, but there was no movie or entertainment, so it seemed like a 20-hour flight. We were scheduled to arrive back home at around 1 o'clock that night. At around midnight, we were told that because of strong headwinds, we would have to stop in Seattle to refuel. While we were waiting for them to refuel, we were told that our new arrival time would be around 5 o'clock that morning. I instantly felt sorry for my poor dad, who would now have to wake up by 4 o'clock, get to the airport, bring me home, and then go to work. While we were waiting for them to refuel the plane, we heard that we would get a new crew for the flight to LA. They refueled the plane and we took off at around 2 o'clock in the morning. Just after we got airborne, the pilot came on the intercom and welcomed us on board. After he finished, I joked with the people sitting near me that the pilot's voice sounded a little like he was drunk. The flight to LA was uneventful. Everything seemed normal as we approached the LA airport. Just as the edge of the runway came into view, the pilot went to full power and we started to climb, flying over the airport. The pilot came on the intercom and said that we had been approaching the wrong runway and he was going to make another attempt. Now his sounding drunk did not seem as funny. We came around and started another approach. Everyone held his or her breath. The landing was harder than normal, but we landed safely. We got off the plane, then had to wait outside in the cold for our luggage. So this was my 1973 trip to Europe. I have always felt lucky that I was at a stage in my life that I was able to take such a trip. The things I learned and the experiences I had instilled in me the desire for travel that I've never lost.